that no matter what, the real estate salespeople as well as the brokerage are responsible for the actions and inactions of the transaction coordinator. You can't blame them. I mean, you can arguably, but it's not a defense in any kind of a legal action.
Exactly. Every item like that is a learning experience. I'm glad it's over. It's settled.
I think that the best thing about mediations is that they can provide closure, and to the extent that you don't use any names and you change the facts to somewhat obscure the situation, you can use it as a true teaching moment.
Yes. Yes.
You just can't mention the jackass's name on the other side of the deal. Capiche?
Yeah, we can't name names.
You have to keep reminding Randy of that. Hey, did you send a copy, that latest copy of the contract around? Randy, did you send that?
Yeah, I sent that this morning, the stuff that Vicki sent last night. You know, the Gov Hutchinson training didn't have these changes, so there are some changes in the contract. Don't ask me how that happened that quickly, but it does. So we sent that. Rachel, we got that out to everybody. Yeah.
Did that come from Rachel?
Came from Rachel.
Okay.
Yeah, we got it.
Okay. So
okay, Randy, you want to make sure everybody else is muted so that you can do your intro and we can get started.
Yes, everybody, please mute yourselves. Mara, you're not muted.
Or I will mute you.
Yes, yeah. Gary has the God stick, so he can mute you. Well, good morning, everyone. It is wonderful again to see my dear friend in person via Zoom, Vicki Nadorf, who, as I've told a lot of you people, and I continue to tell that, you know, I think some of my success, knock on wood, of never personally having a mediation, an arbitration, or anything against me. I hold a lot to being reared as a young manager in 1999 by Vicki. Yesterday, I reported to her after my mediation that all through the mediation, when they were talking to me, I'm thinking, is Vicki going to hit me with that ruler like my second grade teacher did, or do I get a pass? And so, since our client won, even though I took a couple of ruler hits, all in all, I think it was an educational experience. It's behind us now, which I'm grateful for. And again, all the coaching and counseling that Vicki gives on a regular basis is invaluable. And, you know, I don't know, and there's a lot of new agents on board today, the value of our risk management with Vicki here and Bill Jensen, I can't even weigh in number. They really guide us to be better constantly. And those weekly broker letters and that, again, give you something that's real and stuff that you're dealing with every day. So without further ado, the wonderful Vicki, and I want you to know, last night she had to change her slides based on CAR changing the contract yesterday. So her slide presentation was reworked last night. I don't know how she did it, but she's done it. She's amazing. Vicki.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. For those of you who have not been through one of our risk management seminars, normally we have a whole list of topics that we delve into, but not this time. This is a very special legal update because it's only on one topic. It's on the new residential agreement that CAR will be distributing the second week of December. As noted on the screen, it was revised as of yesterday. So you really have the most current information available. What I will be discussing with the new contract applies primarily to that new contract. There are some procedural and other changes which some people are so happy about, they want to start using them now. And unfortunately, you can't. The new contract will not be available until the second week of December, as I mentioned. And until then, you are using the current RPA that's online. However, once the new contract is online, the old contract and approximately 100 other forms will cease to exist in their current form, and they will all be new and dated as of December of 2021. So let's get right down to it. What's new with the new contract? It's a lot. We'll start off with what generally makes people groan. It's 16 pages. However, by having 16 pages, we've eliminated the need for at least one or two forms, and we have created a system which I believe will be much better for everyone. That system includes a grid or chart that takes up 2.5 pages of the first 3 pages of the contract. That grid has a lot of benefits once you get accustomed dealing with it. It will first off help prevent missing the parties making agreements on material terms that were otherwise buried somewhere else in the contract. There is a much simpler and easier way now to deal with personal property. You won't need to create a comparison chart to compare contracts when there are multiple offers. And once you're in contract, if a topic comes up, the grid actually serves as an index to help you find the items that you need to look up. The rest of the contract has been slightly reorganized to keep like-kind terms together. There's improved explanations and disclaimers. And the thing that I believe is responsible for at least 2 of those additional pages is there are much better definitions and use instructions built into the contract. But mostly what I think you're going to find is that by having the vast majority of the negotiable issues up front in the first 3 pages of the contract, you are going to know and understand that document very well, and so will your clients. Today's training approach is truly a contract training class. I'm not going to be spending a lot of time on things that, although they relate to this topic, we won't have time for. For example, this is not a technical training class for how to access and use a zip platform. I will not be spending a great deal of time comparing word for word what was in the current or old contract and what's in the new. I will not be giving a tutorial on how to use all required disclosures. A couple of them are discussed because they are detailed better now in the new contract. And although Randy was in a mediation yesterday, at least by phone, this is not going to be a class on how to handle disputes. So let's jump right into the very first page. And yes, it looks different, but it doesn't start off being different. At the beginning, we have the offer, and it should look very familiar for the most part. On the first line, you have the name of the buyer. You do not put in any other extraneous information, such as their relationship, husband and wife, how they're going to take title, co-tenants, or assignee, nominee, nothing but the name of the buyer. You then put in the property address, including the assessor's parcel number. That number 1 arrow is pointed to the fact that the parcel number line has been extended because it is anticipated that in the wake of SB 9 and some other changes that are planned both at state and local levels, more properties are going to be sold with multiple APN numbers. However, if you run out of space, even with that elongated line, don't worry. If you are on the ZIP platform, a magic document called the Text Overflow Addendum, or TOA, will magically pop up, and it will take care of that extra verbiage. One thing that is confusing for many people is that if you go on to ZIP and you look in the forms library to see what the Text Overflow Addendum looks like, you're not going to find it. It only shows up when you need it. Not sure why it's done that way, but that's the way it works. The second blue arrow points to a brand new warning that has been added because of a number of claims and lawsuits that the real estate industry has had to deal with over the last several years. Often, the postal designation for a property is different than the name of the city or county that actually has jurisdiction over the property. Please note that after warning buyers that this is a possibility, the instructions of the buyer is advised to investigate. This is not something for real estate agents to check out. The third arrow is one of 3 warnings in the contract that this is a multi-page document. Even now, with the current contract, way too many people stop reading after the first page. So this contract has gone out of its way to remind everyone, you got to read all 16 pages. Finally, the fourth arrow is a sentence which has been in the contract for several years now, but I want to highlight it because people still do not seem to understand the significance of it. The first part says that the buyer and seller are referred to herein as the parties. That means whenever you see the word parties with a capital P, it's talking about buyer and seller. This is convenient for everyone, especially when you are doing an addendum or a counteroffer. You don't have to spell out buyer and seller agree, just state the parties agree. That's how this works. The second part of the sentence, though, is actually the more important part. Brokers and agents are not parties to this agreement. What that means is that anything that the brokers or agents are agreeing to do, whether it's to buy a home warranty or take a reduction in commission, those issues belong on a separate agreement, not just a separate addendum to the purchase contract, but a completely separate agreement. Because you're not a party to this document, you cannot agree to something within the document. So keep that warning in mind. The second paragraph is still agency. And there's 3 forms that are referred to in this one section. The first form is the disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships, the good old disclosure form that I know you all love to hate. You have to make sure that you have provided it to the seller before the listing agreement is prepared, and you need to make sure that when you represent the buyer, that you give it to the buyer before preparing the offer. This is just a last-minute warning to remind people to make sure that that's been taken care of. The second star relates to a form which is generally not needed. It is only needed in those situations where you have 2 different brokers representing the seller or 2 different brokerages representing the buyer. This does not mean you have 2 agents from the wine country representing the seller. It's when you have the wine country, for example, co-listing with Remax. I'm not sure why you'd want to do that, but assume you are co-listing with Remax. Then you would use the additional broker acknowledgement form, the ABA form, and despite what CAR believes, the best practice is to also use the agency confirmation addendum form with it to make sure that agency is properly confirmed showing all of the brokers who are representing the seller or who are representing the buyer. This co-brokerage situation occurs generally less than 1% of the time in most areas. But if it does, you check the first box, there's more than one brokerage, and then you indicate whether it's more than one brokerage representing the seller or the buyer, and you use the forms. The third star relates to the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. This is a disclosure and consent form that is required under common law, and it is pre-checked. That's the indication that this is a standard of care form, and you do need to use it in every transaction. You will note I'm highlighting now a brand new part of the agency section. For the last several years, the agency confirmation law was changed, and the third step of providing the agency disclosure form from the buyer's agent to the seller was eliminated. When that happened, something funny happened. People didn't change their practices. This is a reminder that once everybody has met their duty to provide the agency disclosure form to their own client, there is absolutely no logical or legal reason for the buyer's agent to provide a copy of their agency disclosure form to the listing agent, and the listing agent doesn't have to provide a copy of their agency disclosure form to the buyer. If you've got that on a checklist form, strike it out. It's no longer needed. We now start in on the grid. Paragraph 3 is a long paragraph because paragraph 3 is the grid. The first column is a cross-reference to first paragraph is the subparagraphs within paragraph 3. The second column is the paragraph cross-reference to the fuller explanation that's found in the succeeding pages. The third column is the paragraph title or contract term that's being discussed. And then the basic terms and conditions are in the fourth column with additional terms spelled out in the fifth column. Very easy to follow. And this is what it looks like. At the very top, the introduction to paragraph 3 is another one of those warnings that I told you about that reminds everyone this isn't a one-page document or 3-page document. It's 16 pages long, and the parties, buyer and seller, are advised to read all 16 pages. The very first entry is purchase price. Note it's a blank line where you simply fill in the numbers. You no longer have to spell out the words of the price the way you do on a check. This contract also now has the means to indicate right up front that it is an all-cash offer. The next entry, 3B, is close of escrow. This is in the first instance in the terms and conditions column where you have a choice. CAR generally puts the first choice as being the one that is most prevalently used or the one which CAR strongly recommends. In this case, it's blank days after acceptance. That's the choice that is most prevalently used throughout the state of California. Alternatively, you can fill in an actual date and note that the format for the date has been spelled out. The expiration of offer is now included in the upfront terms, so it is very clear right from the beginning how long the seller has to review the offer. The default choice is 3 days after all buyer signatures, or you can fill in a different specific date. The preset time is at 5 p.m., or you can make it 10 a.m. in the morning or 10 p.m. at night. Whatever you want, you can put in here. But one thing that you cannot put in here is upon presentation. That language in at least 2 arbitrations that I'm aware of has resulted in the contract being voided because the seller had inadequate time to properly consider and review the contract. So that old, oh, let's put the pressure on concept should not be used. You need to give a reasonable period of time. If you only want it one day, fine, but no upon presentation. Next, we have the deposits. We have the initial deposit and we have the increased deposit. In the additional term section, the initial deposit is to be put into escrow within 3 or blank business days after acceptance by wire transfer, or a different mode of delivery can be specified by checking the box and including it. This is the only place in the contract where business days are used. Every place else where the word days appears, it's calendar days. This is the only exception. Note that the default is by wire transfer. That is what on surveying escrow officers throughout the state, that was the preferred method. Yes, the buyer can use a check or some other means, but please make sure your buyer understands that whatever method is specified for the initial deposit in this section, that's the way they have to get their deposit into escrow. They can't sign a document saying that they're going to wire transfer the funds and then decide to change their mind and put in a check. The increased deposit has also been preset as to when you are to put that initial deposit into escrow. The most prevalent choice is usually upon removal of all contingencies. So that is the default choice. You can alternatively check the box and put in a date or some other event. Now, I wanted you to notice that in the second column, these cross references to other parts of the contract may cause you concern because, my gosh, what am I supposed to keep flipping back and forth? No, you don't have to keep flipping back and forth because the zip platform is going to be programmed so that if you hover or click on the cross-reference paragraph in the second column, that cross-reference information is going to pop up. So for example, with 5A1 and 5A2, here's the language if I were to click or hover over those numbers. I want to spend a little bit more time on paragraphs 3B1 and 2. They technically have not changed. They still work the way they always have, but there's more information and a different term that is in here now. First off, you'll see in the initial deposit, as well as in the increased deposit, you put in a dollar amount. Yes, the percentage of purchase price can be indicated and calculated, but note the parenthetical note under each of those sections. It says that the percentage is for calculation purposes and is not a contract term. Why is that there? That sounds like something new. It's actually not new. It is something which has been in the car contract for a long time. Many people just didn't understand it. If you take a look at either the seller counteroffer, the seller multiple counteroffer form, or the buyer counteroffer form, all three of those forms had the same pre-printed introductory contract language. Paragraph 1B specifically addresses the issue of what happens if you counter the price. Let's say the seller increases it by $100,000. What happens to all of the other numbers which went in to make up the original price? This is the language that's there. The counteroffer says that unless otherwise agreed in writing, down payment and loan amounts will be adjusted in the same proportion as in the original offer. However, the initial and increased deposit amounts shall remain unchanged from the original offer. So let's say you have a $2 million property and the initial deposit is $20,000. I'm not going to give you the percentage calculation. I know you all can do that. And then you've got another big chunk of money for the increase deposit. If the purchase price is increased by counteroffer to be $2.1 million and the buyer accepts it, then the amount of the initial deposit, that $20,000, it remains the same. It does not get increased unless the seller, at the same time that the seller counters the offer price, counters the amount of the initial deposit and or the increased deposit. When you are preparing a counter offer and you are increasing the price, make sure you take this issue into consideration. And when you do counter the initial deposit or increased deposit, please do not use the term earnest money deposit or EMD. That language does not exist in this contract, and it hasn't existed in the car contract for the last 10 years. Earnest money deposit is a significant legal issue. If terminology is used very loosely by escrow officers and loan officers, but you cannot use it in connection with a purchase contract. This contract does not require an earnest money deposit. Therefore, countering that the earnest money deposit is to be increased, you're countering something that doesn't exist with an illogical term. You need to use the specific terminology that's used in this offer, and that's initial deposit and increased deposit. So keep that language in mind. One additional note regarding paragraph 3D2, the increased deposit. Some people, when they read this, say, wait a minute, Carr's made a typo. Look at this. It says use form DID. It's supposed to say use form RID. Well, newsflash, Carr is getting rid of the RID form, and instead, from now on, you'll be using the DID or DID form. It's exactly the same form. The only thing that's different is that the document has a new name. It's called the delivery of increased deposit because that's really the only thing that the buyer and buyer's agent can actually properly prepare. You can't make it a receipt because the escrow holder is the one who does the receipt of deposit, and escrow holders refuse to use the proper form. Why do you need a separate receipt for the delivery of the increased deposit? Well, the law is clear that if liquidated damages is initialed, the liquidated damage provision only applies to the initial deposit unless at the time of any increased deposit, an additional liquidated damage provision is agreed to. That was the purpose of the RID form. It's the purpose of the DID form. Please note that underneath the title of the DID form, it says that it's to be used at the time increased deposit is paid. It cannot be pre-prepared or signed at the time of the offer or counter offer. Paragraph 3E deals with the loan. There's a nice big red note down at the bottom that all of the loan terms have to be filled out. Anyone who has ever taught or reviewed contracts has stressed the need to specify all of the loan terms. And over the years, the number of loan terms that have to be filled out has gotten smaller and smaller. It is really easy now to fill in all of the loan terms. If the loan terms are not fully filled out and the buyer wants to be able to cancel because they cannot get their loan, that financing contingency is probably not going to work for them if the terms have not been filled into this section. So it is absolutely critical that you fill it all in. First up is the loan amount. You can specify the percentage, but the main issue is putting in a number. The default is that this is a fixed rate loan. If it's going to be an adjustable, you check the box and you put the maximum amount that the buyer is willing to allow the loan to be increased. There is now a default that the buyer is to pay 0 points. If the buyer is willing to pay points, then you put in the specifics. And this same format is in place with the additional financed amount as well. The default is that these will be conventional loans. However, you can check to make it a FHA or VA financing or seller financing. Paragraph E. This one has a default that the loan is for the primary residence of the buyer. Alternatively, the buyer can indicate that it's for secondary home or it's investment property, but I must caution everyone. Any term which relates to a federally insured loan must be truthfully stated in the offer. If it's not, you run the risk of having a lender fraud claim, which is a federal offense, which includes a penalty of 2 years in the federal prison that's not of your choice. So the choice here of occupancy type definitely impacts the type of loan that the buyer can receive, and it could impact other issues as well. Oh, a little symbol has just dropped down to remind me that I need to talk about the FBAC and HID forms. The FHA-VA amendatory clause has a car logo on it, but in reality, this is a federally required form that must be included in an offer if the buyer is securing either FHA or VA financing. The first yellow paragraph is one that many people unfortunately do not understand. It's really simple. It doesn't matter what the contract says. You'll even note that it says earnest money deposit in this. This document overrides the purchase contract and makes it mandatory that the buyer must have an appraisal contingency. The parties can agree that the appraisal report can be less than the full purchase value, but I would recommend that nobody put in a value there without checking with the lender to see what the minimum amount can be. The second yellow paragraph is a reminder that buyers are responsible for determining whether or not the price and the condition of the property are acceptable to them. Our contract really already says that, but this is a federal form. This language has to be there. In addition, this form specifies that if for any reason during escrow the purchase price increases, then a new FHA-VA amendatory clause must be used. It's not needed if the price decreases, only if it increases. And with a new amendatory clause, you get a new appraisal contingency. The second form that's discussed in the grid with FHA and VA financing is the HID form. This document, which is essentially an FHA form, recommends the buyers protect themselves by getting a home inspection, and it actually explains what a home inspection does and does not do. Some people use it in non-FHA transactions. It's recommended for use in VA transactions. This is an interesting form. Some buyers get confused by it because down at the bottom where the buyer signs, it says, well, if I wish to get a home inspection report, then I should do so, and I should do so as quickly as possible. That's great, but if the purchase contract they sign does not allow for that, then buyers get confused as to why they signed this document when the contract doesn't allow them to get a home inspection report. If there's going to be a difference between this language and what's in the contract, make sure you have an email to the client that the client understands that although they've signed this indicating that they may wish to do so, they have chosen not to do so. Some sellers don't actually like VA and FHA finance. And the reason for it may be a violation of fair housing, but usually speaking, the reason is that the VA and FHA generally has a lengthy list of lender-required repairs and seller actions, and many sellers don't want to undertake those repairs or actions. It's also been confusing in the past precisely how the buyer is to ask for the lender-required repairs. There's no new form, but there's a revised form. The request for repair form has been revised to include a section in it for lender-required repairs or other costs and expenses that the lender is expecting the seller to take care of. So if you're representing a buyer with a VA or FHA loan, and there are lender-required repairs or expenses, you use Part 3 of the request for repair. And everyone, buyers and sellers, need to keep in mind that although the seller does not have to agree to any or all of these requests, if the seller does not agree to the requests, it's extremely likely that the buyer will not get the VA or FHA financing. Finally, we come to 3F, which is the balance of down payment. Some inexperienced buyers need to be given a little bit more guidance here. They need to be reminded that the balance of down payment is not necessarily the ultimate amount of money that they are going to be bringing in, because they may have agreed to pay for escrow or title fees, as an example. That's the end of page 1, and we're off and running to page 2. Up at the top, we now have a new section for the buyer to make a request for the seller to give a credit. Now, this section has never been in the contract. It's always been something which agents have filled in the additional term section. So it's very nice that it's here, but the reason it is here is because there's been confusion as to what happens with the credit when there's a counter. You will note the same parenthetical language that the percentage is for calculation purposes only and is not a contractual term. That is there because if the price is countered, unless the seller or the buyer counters to change the amount of the credit, the dollar amount that is here is going to remain. It's not going to change. Finally, in the additional terms column, the default specifies that the seller credit is to be applied to closing costs. However, if that's not what the credit is for, there's an optional box. But since the vast majority of contracts are written that the credit is for closing costs, that's the default choice. We have an additional finance terms for any other terms related to financing issues which do not alter the purchase price. Any other terms for the purchase contract go in paragraph 3R. Paragraphs 3H1 through 3 all have the word verification in it because these are all items which the buyer must verify. The first is verification that the buyer really can pay all cash. And there's verification of down payment and closing costs. And finally, verification that a loan application has been made. Please note that the default choice in all 3 of these verifications is that the documentation is attached to the offer. That's because that is the strongest way CAR can recommend that buyer's agents get that documentation before writing up the offer. It makes your buyer's offer ever so much stronger because you can prove upfront to the seller that your buyer really can pay all cash or that your buyer really has submitted the loan application. Alternatively, you can specify that it will be delivered a number of days after acceptance, but the default is definitely attach it. Please also note the circled area. A funny thing happened in the RPA study group. I was very proud to be able to serve on the committee that worked on revising this document. We had an argument one day. It lasted for well over an hour. Both lawyers and practitioners all took completely different positions on what was the difference between a pre-qualification letter and a pre-approval letter. It was shocking how little agreement could be reached. So it was decided that CAR would, in effect, canvass a number of mortgage brokers and lenders to find out what the definitional difference is between those two documents. Sadly, there was complete inconsistency there as well. And in the process of doing that, it was discovered that some lenders are now providing a third product, which is called a fully underwritten pre-approval document, which shows that the lender has done a much deeper dive into the ability of the buyer to qualify for the financing. Well, since we couldn't figure out which form to call it and what the definition was, it was decided to just put a series of checkboxes, and the buyer's agent then indicates which one of the three, the letter that they received from the mortgage broker or lender, what is it called? So you'd make sure that you read the letter, and then whatever the letter is called, then you check the box. That sort of makes it necessary that you get the pre-approval or pre-qual or underwritten pre-approval letter before you write the offer. But there's an interesting definition which now has been added to the CAR contract in paragraph 6B. It doesn't matter what that letter is called. There are certain things which must be in the letter. The buyer's lender or mortgage broker must state that, based on a review of buyer's written application and credit report, buyer is pre-qualified or pre-approved for any new loan specified in paragraph 3E, which of course brings up the issue that you have to actually fill in all of the terms in 3E. You cannot leave it blank unless there is a default choice. And we've tried to give you as many default choices as possible. But this new language, I thought, although I understand it and most people do, I thought it might be a little bit confusing for people. So I created this chart. You're going to be getting a copy of most of the slides that I use today. So you will actually have this chart. You don't have to quickly write it down. But whether you're the buyer's agent or you're working with the seller, it's absolutely critical that you carefully review the verification documentation that's been provided by the buyer's mortgage broker or lender. You have to make sure that the contents of that letter complies with the terms of the contract. Whether it's called pre-qual, pre-approval, the letter from the lender or mortgage broker must state that it is based on a review of two things. The first is the buyer's written application, and the second, the buyer's credit report. And most importantly, it must specify that the buyer is in fact pre-qualified or pre-approved for the loan that's specified. Hopefully this chart will make it easier for you to follow this new requirement. 2 lines have been left blank in the chart. It's to avoid people thinking that there are some other numbers. I think it's kind of funny, but the committee voted to do it. Paragraphs 3J and 3K merely set the time frame for 2 important concepts. The first is the buyer's final verification of condition, the old walkthrough, and then a new concept. We now have a time limit built into the contract for when the buyer can assign or partially assign their interest in the purchase contract. Those of us who've ever been involved in reviewing contracts or trying to help get deals closed know how horrible it is for somebody to try and do an assignment 3 days prior to the close of escrow. It's a mess. So what this contract is now doing is saying the parties can agree on a time frame. The default is 17 days. You can make it longer or shorter, but now there's a limit as to when the buyer can request to do an assignment. And I will be talking much more about assignments when we get to paragraph 23. The time frame for all contingencies are now spelled out in paragraph 3L. 3L does a lot. First off, it groups all the contingencies together for easy reference. All of the contingencies are default to 17 days. However, instead of making all contingencies 17 days, you can actually add flexibility for your buyer by specifying you need 5 days, for example, to do the house inspection report, or you need 30 days to do the loan, or 40 days to get the appraisal report. Whatever it is, you have that flexibility. What you cannot do is enter the number 0 into any of these timeframes. The ZIP platform will be programmed so that it cannot accept 0. Some people thought 0 was a way to say there's no contingency. Doesn't work that way. It technically doesn't work that way under the current contract. It definitely doesn't work that way under the new one. 2 contingencies can actually be quickly removed by checking a box, and the rest require checking a box and adding the contingency removal form. The loan and appraisal contingencies are the 2 that can be easily removed or waived by simply checking a box. Buyer doesn't want to have a loan contingency. They check the box, no loan contingency. The contingency removal form is not needed to remove that contingency. The appraisal contingency, same thing. It also has the ability to check that it is not included. A new aspect of the appraisal contingency is, just like with FHA and VA financing, the buyer and seller can agree that the property has to appraise at an amount that is different than the purchase price. The default choice is that at a minimum, it has to be the purchase price, or it can be some lesser amount. This probably isn't going to be too effective in all transactions. In fact, I think it's only going to work in those where the buyer is securing far less than 80% financing, but the committee wanted to include much more flexibility here. You will also note that under the checkbox saying that there's no appraisal contingency, there's a reminder that that's nice, you check the box, but gosh, if it's VA or FHA financing, you're going to have an appraisal contingency. Obviously, if you put these contingencies into play, you don't check these boxes, then during the transaction, then the buyer will use the contingency removal form to remove those contingencies. The CR form is just not used up front to remove or waive those 2 contingencies. The rest of the contingencies are in 3L1 through 7. First up, we have the investigation of property contingency. This is another instance where understanding the terminology of the contract is critical. As you will see when we get into paragraphs 8C and 12, the investigation contingency is a very broad concept. If you refer to this contingency as the inspection contingency, which is old school language, you're actually misstating this concept and you could be creating confusion. So make sure you're using the right terminology. Notice in blue that the reference to removal or waiver contingencies is listed in the final column. If any of these other contingencies are to be removed or waived with the contract, you must check the box and then attach the fully completed CR indicating precisely which contingencies are being removed or waived. The blue arrow is pointing to some new language, and concept's been around for a while. The new language, it's been, I think, improved because the informational access to property is not a contingency and it's not a cancellation right. It's the ability of a buyer to go in and inspect, evaluate, measure, do whatever they want to the property, but whatever they find, they cannot use that as a means to cancel the contract. Now, this is how the language was up until yesterday. The language has been changed, and there's a nice little reminder that the informational access to property applies even if all contingencies are removed. So if the buyer goes in and says, hey, seller, I've removed all contingencies with my offer. They've checked the boxes for loan and appraisal waiver. They've checked the CR. They say all contingencies removed. Unless the seller counters out the informational access to property, which I don't recommend, then the buyer will still have a right to access the property for the agreed upon period of time. The default is 17 days. But keep in mind, it's not really a contingency, even though it's here, and it does not create a cancellation right. In the current contract, there is a time frame for the buyer to review several types of documents, including those provided by the seller, by the title company, and the HOA, not to mention the leased and liened items. The language 17 or blank days after acceptance or 5 days after receipt, whichever is later, has always really defined the time period for the contingency. But some people thought it meant other things as well. Sadly, especially for people like my partner, CAR has decided to take a position. It's not a legal position. It's not in a statute book somewhere, and it's not in any case. CAR has simply made a philosophical choice to make it clear that this language, 17 or blank days after acceptance or 5 days after receipt, whichever is later, merely establishes the time frame for the contingency. And if the contingency is removed, the late delivery of documents will not revive or trigger a new contingency. Other rights for the buyer to cancel may exist, but their contingency rights are gone if they are removed. And we'll go into greater detail on that when I get to paragraph 8. Right now, the most important lesson I can leave with you on the subject of contingencies is this. Even now, with the current contract, before you remove contingencies, I want you to see that red stop sign. I want you to stop. Do not have your buyer remove contingencies if you do not have absolutely all of the documents. And if you're not sure you have all of the documents, I would urge you to use the notice to seller to perform to make sure that the seller does provide that documentation before the contingency is removed. Another contingency is the sale of buyer's other property. If a buyer has to sell other property to buy this property, then they have to do two things with this contract. First, they check the box in paragraph L8 and then attach a fully completed COP form to the offer. I generally strongly endorse CAR forms. There are a few exceptions. One of them is the COP form. I think it is unnecessarily complicated. I do not see the purpose in having quite as many choices as are included. And I see far too many agents messing it up on both sides of the deal. But what fascinates me the most is that if sellers are willing to allow the buyer to sell other property as a contingency to the buyer buying the seller's property, why is it that sellers never counter the choices that are made in the COP? I think it's because sellers aren't really reading the COP. Listing agents, you need to have your seller go through each one of those sections on the COP form. And if the seller doesn't like the choices, like seller, you can try and find another property and, you can have another buyer and put them in backup, but you can't give us notice to remove our contingency throughout the whole period of the contract. That's a choice the buyers often make in the COP. And it's the worst possible choice for the seller. So please keep in mind, sellers can counter the terms in the COP. They can either say no COP, they can use a counteroffer to change specified paragraphs within the COP, or the seller can have a counteroffer and attach a new COP form and require that the buyer sign that. It's a thought that I think way too many listing agents don't have when the COP form is presented. Paragraphs 3M1 through 3 all deal with possession. 3M1 merely sets the time of day that the possession is to be delivered to the buyer, whereas 3M2 sets the date. You'll note that there are default choices in both. The time of possession default is upon notice of recordation, which is the standard of practice apparently in Southern California. In Northern California, we usually just have a time specific. The alternative default is 6 p.m., but you can specify any other time of day. With seller occupied or vacant units, the default choice is the buyer is going to get possession at close of escrow, or if the seller is retaining possession for 29 days or less, then the first box gets checked and the contract requires use of the SIP form. If it's going to be 30 or more days, then the second box is checked, and then the contract requires use of the RLAS form. With tenant-occupied property, this contract now requires use of a new form called the TOPA. Here it is. This is another form that CAR is bringing out that I cannot in good conscience endorse for any owner of property or for any new owner of property. If a buyer is acquiring tenant-occupied property and they are going to acquire it subject to the tenant's rights and the tenant is staying there, then this form is fine. But it is not fine for the vast majority of situations where problems erupt. Let's take a quick look at the TOPA form. Right underneath the identification of the buyer and seller, there is a note that is critical for an understanding of this topic. It says that tenant shall mean, that term tenant, is an adult person other than the seller who is occupying the property, whether or not paying rent. Now, normally when you use the term tenant, you think, okay, this is somebody who is paying rent, whether they have a lease or not, they're paying rent. But this is a much broader term. Let's say you have a duplex. The seller resides in one unit and Uncle Charlie resides in the second unit. Uncle Charlie is an occupant of that unit. He doesn't pay rent. For landlord-tenant law, he's not really a tenant, but he is a tenant for purposes of the CAR contract and for use of the TOPA form. Paragraph 1A gives the tenant the right to stay. However, if the buyer wants to be able to take possession, then buyer's only choice is paragraph 1B. 1B carries some interesting penalty provisions that you need to be aware of before your buyer signs. If the property is to be vacant, then it's the seller's obligation to use good faith to get the tenant out of the property. The parties agree that the tenant has to be out at a specified time frame, a certain number of days before close of escrow. This TOPA form, though, then goes on to state that if the tenant has not been removed, then the buyer has only two choices. Choice number one, the buyer may cancel, but the only thing that the buyer can recover as damages for the cancellation is whatever the buyer paid out of pocket in connection with the purchase. So, for example, paying the appraiser, paying inspectors. They can't get any other damages. Alternatively, the buyer can agree to go forward with the deal and sit around and wait for the tenant to be removed, but then the buyer waives their right to make any claim for damages caused by the delay. These are not buyer-friendly provisions. These are seller provisions. And if I were going to be buying property that is tenant occupied and I want the tenant out before I take possession, I wouldn't use this form. I would have myself or any other buyer go to their own local landlord tenant attorney and have a proper document drafted that will better meet the needs of your buyer. Do not attempt to create alternative terms. That would be the illegal practice of law. So if the TOPA has to be used and the tenant is going to stay in possession and your buyer is fine with it, fine, the TOPA is okay. But if the buyer wants the tenant out, then strongly recommend in an email to your buyer that they not sign the TOPA without first consulting with their own local landlord tenant attorney. Counting days after close of escrow for how long the seller has the right to possess the property has been a difficult concept for a lot of buyers and sellers to grasp. Both the seller to remain in possession addendum, the SIP, and the RLAS form have new language added in the introduction. And this is how it's going to work. Let's assume your seller is to retain possession for 15 days after close of escrow, and they're signing the SIP form. The SIP form states that close of escrow shall be deemed day 0 for purposes of counting days for the term of this license to remain in possession. What does that mean? Well, let's look at a calendar. Let's assume that escrow closes on Tuesday. That's day 0. The next day, or the day after close of escrow, is day 1. You then count out 15 days. If there is no agreement as to the time that the seller is to vacate, or if the seller has all day on the 15th, then that means the seller retains possession until midnight. And the buyer's first full day of possession is on Thursday, the 16th. That's how you count the days. Hopefully, these instructions that are built in the forms will make it easier for everybody to do the calculations. Paragraphs 3N 1 through 4 sets the time frame for the seller to pay for ordering or delivering seller required documents. That includes the certification that the smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, and water heater bracing has all been taken care of. Please note that the time for performance is now 3 to 7 days after acceptance. Lenders have been complaining that this certification documentation has been done too late. Escrow holders are complaining that their instructions haven't been signed and returned quickly enough. So this sets the timeframes for a much shorter period after acceptance than what you may be accustomed to. So make sure you and your clients understand those timeframes. We're now on to the third page and my favorite part of the chart. At the very top of page 3 is paragraph 3P1. This is the personal property chart. And it actually could not be any easier unless it was longer. So how does this work? Well, let's say your seller, if your buyer is writing up the offer and says, yeah, I definitely want the stove, definitely want the refrigerator, I want the washers, the dryers. Oh, I also want that freezer in the garage. For those of you who do not know, freezers are different than refrigerators. So you would check the box and write in freezer in garage. It's that simple. Any items that are not checked, they're not included. Please note that there is a preset check mark next to bathroom mirrors. That's because many of us on the committee were tired of having sellers take the mirrors because they didn't think they were fixtures or attached. Well, now the mirrors have to stay unless the parties agree otherwise. And trust me, you will be doing your sellers a huge favor if you show them this chart before any offers come in and determine what items they don't want to leave behind. Bottom line, if your buyer wants it, check the box. If it's not listed, and there's even the possibility of a question mark, check the box and fill it in. If you are relying on terms such as built-in or fixture, you are doing your client a disservice. Pre-done in this checklist are above-ground pools and spas. That's because of all of the items which people assume are fixtures are built in. These tend to be some of the most expensive ones. So we now have the checkbox. If there is a hot tub or spa and the buyer wants it, check the box. Paragraph 3B2 is for anything that the buyer doesn't want or that they know that the seller wants to be able to take. Again, you check the box, you list the items, they're excluded. Q has all of those wonderful terms that people don't like to fill out. The further into the contract these items were placed, the less likely it was that people filled it out. It's now on the third page. You can't miss it, and you need to deal with it. This determines who's going to pay for, among other things, getting the NHDS report. Please note the note that's up at the top of the fourth column. You'll see that for each one of the various different choices of who is going to pay for any of the items, it's buyer, seller, and then there's a checkbox for both. Those have been options that have been around for a long time, and then there's blank lines. Generally speaking, people have checked the box both and then said 50-50, or they haven't said anything. Well, the default now, based upon the note at the head of that fourth column, is that if the box both is checked, it's automatically agreed it's 50-50. You don't have to write in 50-50 in all those blank lines where you check the box both. What do you put into those blank lines? Well, let's say the seller wants to pay 75% of something and the buyer's going to pay 25%. I don't know why anybody would want to do that, but if they do, that's what the blank lines are for. What the blank lines are not for is to specify that the agent is going to pay for any of that. Why? Because the agents aren't parties to the contract, so it doesn't belong there. Whew. When you think about it, this really makes it a lot easier to do everything. Please note that Q4 is the certification, is not the certification of the smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, and water heater bracing. This is who pays for doing that work. Yes, the seller certifies it, but the buyer could pay for the work. It's negotiable, and that's why it's in here. government required point of sales and directed remedial actions is in Q5 and Q6. If it is a significant point of sale requirement, such as having to do with inspections of sewer laterals, this language may not be sufficient. Many local associations of realtors are creating their own contract documents for government required point of sale inspections and reports, as well as corrective action. If you have been using the current language in the CAR form for your local issues and it's been working fine, continue to do that. But just keep in mind, this section is only used for local requirements that must by local ordinance be met so as to close escrow. Q7.
Vicki, real quick, if we don't have any governmental required point of sales like Marin County does, how do we deal with that portion?
You leave it blank.
Leave it blank, okay.
Or if you want, you can put in the blank line, none. If it doesn't apply, you don't need to use it. You'll note that I have 2 question marks up on the screen right now. Where you see question marks in this section, that means you get to, as the buyer agent, identify who the provider is going to be, whether it's who provides the NHDS, the escrow holder, or anyone else. Added to the escrow fee section, in addition to seller, buyer, and both checkboxes, there is a new checkbox, and that is for each party to pay their own escrow fees. This is apparently very prevalent in Southern California and in some parts of Northern California. You just now have an additional option for how the fees are going to be paid. HOA transfer fees have been a huge problem in many areas, in large part because there's no consistent terminology and there's no statute which regulates it. So this now specifies that unless otherwise agreed, seller pays for the separate move-out fees and buyer pays for the separate move-in fees. Finally, the buyer chooses who is going to be providing the home warranty. They should always specify what the cost is to be, especially if the seller is going to pay for it. And then there's blank lines to specify the type. We're now off the grid. We've now dealt with the vast majority of the issues that you need to understand this contract. So far, I don't think it's been too hard, but let's get into the meat and potato of the rest of the document. Paragraph 4A, property type addenda. This is a new section. The 2 forms highlighted in yellow, the probate agreement purchase addendum and the manufactured or mobile home purchase addendum, are brand new. What this contract has been designed to do is the RPA will now serve as the base contract, even for probate and mobile home sales. If it is probate or a mobile home sale, you then simply add the appropriate addendum to convert the RPA into that other type of contract. That way you don't have to learn a whole new contract. You simply have to learn a new addendum. It should make it a lot easier, especially because so often people forget that with probate and mobile homes, you need a different type of contract. So you don't have to completely rewrite the contract. If you started off with the RPA, you simply just have to add the appropriate addendum. We then have 3 other addenda listed here in green. These are for the types of ownership or residency involved. The first is the TOPA. Next, we have a TIC form as well as a stock cooperative form. Those forms are only needed when that type of situation exists. And if it is tenancy in common or if there are stock cooperatives, then in addition to the new addenda, you will also need a couple of additional advisories. Paragraph 4B. These are the standard addenda that you are most accustomed to using, including the one that has the longest title ever, septic inspection, well inspection, property monument, and propane tank allocation of cost addendum. But there are also other addenda which are used far less frequently, such as buyer intent to exchange or seller intent to exchange. Please look at this section and don't attempt to write your own language if it's going to be, for example, a short sale, or if it's going to be an exchange. Use the appropriate referenced addendum. Check the box and it will auto-populate with the offer. A new addendum that's been listed as the court confirmation addendum form. This is to be used when court confirmation is required other than with probate sales. For example, bankruptcy and some divorce actions, you use the CCA form. There are two categories of advisories in paragraph 4C. The first are pre-checked. These are the ones that CAR is telling you are standard of care and need to be used in every single transaction, whether you like the forms or not. The second category of advisories are those that CAR deems to be optional. They only get used when they apply. For example, if it's a sale of property held in trust, you use the trust advisory. If it's a short sale, you use the short sale information advisory. But in all transactions, I strongly urge that you make sure that your client definitely gets the statewide buyer and seller advisory, the SBSA. It is a critical document. Buyers and sellers really need to have that document before they enter into a contract so that they can better understand other terms in the contract, such as arbitration, mediation, and liquidated damages. That document can be signed in counterpart. Buyers and sellers do not have to sign the same document. That form can also be used to check to make sure that you have any local advisories, such as the forms that Norbar has for Lake, Mendocino, Napa, and Sonoma counties. Paragraph 5A explains the deposit. You'll see that there's a little red verbiage in there specified in paragraph 3D2. That's the latest edition. It's not substantive, it's just another cross-reference. Note again, it's the initial deposit. This section explains that if whatever methodology is chosen by the buyer to deliver the deposit, if the escrow holder doesn't accept that methodology, for example, the escrow holder says they're not going to take a personal check, then under this contract, automatically the buyer must wire transfer the funds. The method of delivery of the initial deposit also controls the delivery method for the increased deposit. Paragraph 5A3 is not a new concept. It's in a new location and it's been slightly rewritten. This particular paragraph serves as a reminder that if the liquidated damages provision has been initialed, it creates the sole remedy for any buyer breach. And it also warns that buyers and sellers should not attempt to create their own non-refundable or early release of deposit provision without their own qualified California real estate attorney, because it could be illegal or unenforceable. And if there's anything that I'm really jazzed about, is that this contract no longer talks about sending clients to an attorney. It's using the language that Bill Jansen and I have been using for the last 10 years, even before our partnership was formed. Clients need a qualified California real estate attorney to guide them on legal real estate matters. Paragraph 5B deals with all cash, and it serves as a warning that if the buyer has checked all cash, the purchase agreement is not contingent on the buyer obtaining a loan. It also serves as a reminder that the buyer has to provide the verification information that is specified in the grid in 3H1. Paragraphs 5C and 5D, loan and balance of down payment. There's a new provision here which you need to read carefully. This contract now allows the seller and or the listing agent to contact the buyer's lender for one thing and for one thing only, to find out the status of the loan. That's the only question that can be asked. My concern is that now that the authorization exists, listing agents should definitely do it. Because if you're given the right to check on the loan status, you should do it. You are better protecting your client if you do it. So please keep in mind, though, that if you make that call, or if your seller makes that call, sends an email, do not discuss anything about the transaction. Don't discuss who the buyer is or isn't. Don't say anything about the buyer. Simply ask about the status of the loan. If the buyer changes lenders, this provision also makes it a requirement that the buyer has to notify the seller of any change in lender. And of course, there's yet some more reminders of what you have to do with an FHA and VA loan. So please keep in mind, the seller can say no to those lists of repairs, which brings me to an interesting issue. If the loan contingency is still in effect and the seller says they're not going to make any repairs, we know the lender isn't going to fund the loan. But if the loan contingency is in effect, then guess what? The buyer will have a basis to cancel. That's the seller's risk of saying no to the FHA list of required repairs. On the other hand, buyers should not remove their loan contingency until after there is a determination as to what the seller will or will not agree to, and whether or not what the seller will agree to will satisfy the lender. Because if the buyer has removed their loan contingency and then the seller indicates that the seller is not going to do the repairs, the buyer will not have a legitimate basis to cancel and may find themselves in default. So make sure you understand the interrelationship of the timing on that type of financing. Paragraph 5E, it's the standard provision that reminds everyone that the maximum amount of credits the buyer can receive is limited by whatever the buyer's lender is going to specify. Now, keep in mind, if it's an all-cash deal and there's no lender, then you don't worry about lender limits. But if the buyer is getting institutional financing and the lender says the maximum amount of credits is 3%, then it doesn't matter who's giving the credit, seller, the agents, even a mortgage broker. The totality of the credits have to be within the limits established by the lender. And if the negotiated amount of credits exceeds what the lender will approve, that does not give the buyer the automatic right to reduce the purchase price. So that is the warning that is now in paragraph 5E. Please also keep in mind that if the lender says 3% is the maximum number of credits, that's not just for what's paid through escrow. It's all credits, everything that the buyer receives, even stuff paid outside of escrow. And as my partner Bill Jansen and I often heard each other say, payments made outside of escrow with a federally insured loan generally equals lender fraud. Don't do it. Paragraph 6A and 6B, this is the explanation for the verification of what must be provided when the buyer is securing a loan. Refer back to that wonderful little chart that I gave you. It explains everything in this paragraph. And now we're on to the 5th page, and a paragraph that is often misunderstood. And the primary reason it is misunderstood is because of the very first part of the paragraph, which I have boxed off in red. It says, seller is relying on buyer's representation of the type of financing. I kind of wish that wasn't there. Oh, I wish it would go away. And I wish it would go away because that's usually where sellers stop reading. Yeah, I'm relying on the type of financing. But there's a lot of qualifying language that follows after it. So let me take you through the paragraph in a really simple, easy way. Yes, the seller is relying on the type of financing that the buyer says they're going to use. Let's pretend it's all cash. There's no question that no matter what the buyer has put into the grid, whether it's all cash or a loan, the buyer must make a good faith effort to pursue the financing specified. But the buyer has the right to try to obtain other financing, such as they said they were going in with cash. They have proof that they got the cash. Can they still try to get a loan? Yes, they can. Here's the rules. Yes, the buyer can try to get that alternative financing, but if the buyer can't obtain that other financing, then the buyer will have no cancellation right for not being able to get that other financing. So if they say they're going to do all cash and they can't get a loan, then they have to proceed with all cash. This paragraph makes it clear that the seller has no obligation to cooperate with buyers' efforts to obtain alternative financing. But I love it when contracts have buts and howevers in it. But the seller cannot refuse access to the buyer's appraiser if the buyer still has an investigation contingency in place, an appraisal contingency in place, or the informational access provision is still in place. If any one of those three is still at play, then the seller has to allow the buyer's lender's appraiser to have access to the property. And the seller cannot refuse to close simply because the buyer has obtained other financing. I was involved in a very obnoxious claim that was resolved through mediation. And the seller and the buyer's agent felt that because it said all cash and the buyer ended up coming in with a loan, that the seller could refuse to close. The mediator didn't think that was the way it should be. I didn't think it was the way it should be. Now this contract makes it clear in this paragraph. If the buyer is able to close, the seller is still protected regardless of how the money is coming into the escrow, because as far as the seller side of the deal, they're still getting all cash. So keep this in mind. Please read it carefully. And if an offer comes in and it says all cash, or it has loan terms that are a little strange, anytime you think that the buyer might try to get a loan, especially true with all cash, this is what you should be telling your sellers. Please explain that whether a buyer is paying all cash or getting a loan, the seller must carefully review the buyer's verification of all funds necessary to close. Sellers are not being prompted to do that as part of the selection process, and they need to do that. Tell sellers not to rely on the stated financing provision and explain all of those little sub-issues that are detailed in that last slide, which you'll be getting a copy of. If the buyer has cash but decides to get a loan and the deal can still close, the seller is protected. So the seller should not interfere and try to cancel. Stated financing is an interesting concept. It's been around for years. I think this particular contract is now the first time that it's actually fully detailed for everyone to better understand it. Paragraph 7A is closing and possession. CAR has taken the unique position of saying that they do not encourage misrepresenting occupancy status. That's nice. However, knowingly doing so constitutes lender fraud. When it comes to possession being different than the close of escrow, both principals should confer with their insurance broker, and the buyer needs to confer with their lender if the seller is to retain possession, because the lender may establish some limits as to how long the seller can stay. In other words, if the buyer is going to agree to allow the seller to retain possession, they need to check with their lender first. Buyers should be consulting with their mortgage broker or lender long before you write up the offer, so that the contract can be written in a way that is consistent with what the lender is going to require. Whoa, we're moving really pretty fast now. Now we're on condition of property on closing. This is a provision that all sellers should be shown. It specifies that unless otherwise agreed, everything must be in the same physical condition as on date of acceptance when the buyer is given possession. Everything must be maintained in substantially the same condition, and the seller has to remove all personal property and debris not included in the sale. Now, that language has been around for a long time. Something new has been added, though, because way too often sellers leave, how should I be charitable about this? They leave stuff behind. Stuff that, they didn't include in the sale, but they don't necessarily want it either. Or there wasn't enough room on the truck when they left. I've heard all sorts of excuses over the years. Well, what is the buyer supposed to do with that stuff? Now there's a procedure for it. Anything that the seller leaves behind once possession is delivered to the buyer, that material is all deemed to be abandoned property. Then the buyer, after first giving a specialized notice to the seller to get rid of that stuff, then the buyer will be perfectly free to sell, remove, do whatever they want to do with that stuff. But the key here in this outlined in red section is that if it's not removed by the seller, the buyer has to give notice. You're probably wondering, what does that notice look like and how can I get my hands on it? Well, I have the answer. CAR has a sample forms library on the Zip platform. There is actually a letter already there called the Abandoned Personal Property in Residential Transactions letter. It satisfies all of the legal requirements for the buyer to give the seller notice. Agents should not be sending or delivering the notice. They simply give this letter to the buyer so that the buyer can take care of their contractual obligations. Paragraph 7C, D, and E deal with some topics which, for whatever reason, seem to get muddled. First off, if the seller is remaining in possession after close of escrow, there are now 3 recommendations for the parties in this scenario. The first, the parties, buyer and seller, are advised to consult with their insurance and legal advisors for information about liability and damage or injury to persons and personal and real property. So should agents be giving opinions on this? No, other than to point this language out to their clients and suggest they consult with their insurance and legal advisors. The second recommendation is the buyer is advised to, oh my gosh, there's some good language. Consult with the buyer's lender about the impact of seller's occupancy on buyer's loan. And of course, my favorite recommendation, consult with a qualified California real estate attorney. I already mentioned that that's probably going to be necessary for a lot of buyers if the TOPA addendum is proposed to be used. This is the contract paragraph which says that that is okay. We have had in the CAR contract for a long time the fact that at close of escrow, the seller is to assign all assignable warranties over to the buyer and to actually deliver the warranty documentation. There's now a nice note in here that says that the agents cannot determine whether or not any of the warranties are assignable. If the parties can't figure that out from reviewing the contract documents that they have regarding those items, they should review it with who? Their qualified California real estate attorney. Finally, paragraph E is something that is not going to sit well with many sellers who retain possession of the property. It specifies all of the things that the seller is to provide the buyer at close of escrow, like the keys, the access mechanisms to open up the garage, what you need to open up the mailbox, the passwords and codes to enter the building. All of that has to be given to the buyer at close of escrow, even if the seller is retaining possession. Now, most sellers, when they retain possession, they don't want the buyer to have that material. If your seller is agreeing to retain possession, point this paragraph out and suggest that the seller consider a counteroffer if the seller doesn't want to deliver the keys and codes to the buyer. Just a thought. Sellers get very upset when they find out they have to do this type of thing. So please make sure your seller understands what is happening in the pre-printed portions of the contract. Our next paragraph, it deals with contingencies and what can be done with it. Paragraph 8 starts out in paragraph A with the loans, and it deals with whether or not you have a loan contingency and whether or not you have an appraisal contingency and the interrelationship between those two contingencies. Yes, they are two separate contingencies, and they are also two separate things that are required for buyers to get a loan. First, to get a loan, the buyer must qualify for the financing. Second, to get a loan, the property must qualify. Two different issues. The loan contingency must be in place. That is, it cannot be waived or removed. If the buyer wants to be able to cancel because the buyer does not qualify for the loan. The appraisal contingency must be in place if the buyer wants to cancel because the property does not appraise at agreed value. Keep in mind these are separate contingencies, and way too often, one or both are removed prematurely. They don't have to be removed at the same time. In fact, they shouldn't. Here's the key. Let's say that the appraisal report is late. It hasn't come in. But the buyer decides, well, I qualify for the loan. I'm okay. Let's remove the financing contingency as well as the appraisal contingency. Well, if the buyer does qualify, but then it's discovered that the property doesn't appraise, then the buyer has a problem because they're going to have to proceed with the transaction even because they don't have the appraisal contingency in place. Too many people believe that if they still have the loan contingency in place, that they can cancel when the property doesn't appraise because the lender isn't funding the loan. The reason why the lender is funding the loan has to relate to the specific contingency that the buyer is trying to exercise. So keep that issue in mind. There's an important insurance advisory in A8A2 because in addition to the buyer qualifying for the property, in addition to the property qualifying for the loan, many lenders are now refusing to grant the loan because the type of insurance coverage that is available is inadequate as far as the lender is concerned, or it's too costly for the buyer. this is a difficult issue for many people in the real estate industry to grasp. But this contract now makes it clear that if the sole reason for the lender refusing to fund the loan is due to the lack of available insurance or the cost of the insurance, the buyer needs to still have their investigation contingency in place. So, what does that really mean for everyone? Well, the idea that you should just blanket remove all contingencies is a horrible idea. That's one of the reasons why we had the market conditions advisory. But more than ever, it's critical that at the outset of the transaction, especially if the buyer is going to get a loan, the buyer needs to check out the availability and cost of insurance, because they cannot use the loan contingency as a basis to cancel due to the insurance issue. The buyer's only right to cancel as a result of not being able to secure fire insurance is if the buyer still has the investigation contingency in place. So that's why, if you weren't already doing it, you need to make sure buyers check on that issue at the beginning, not the end of the deal. Paragraphs 8A3 through 8A5 have some important loan reminders that buyers have a loan contingency. They should be reviewing the points in A3 and A4. And if there's no loan contingency, they need to be shown A5. This paragraph merely explains the significance of the various issues involved with either having a loan or not having a loan contingency. There's also some important advisories that are in the new contract regarding appraisals. Again, in this section, if the buyer cancels based upon appraised value, something has to happen. The buyer has to give the seller the appraisal report. That makes sense, doesn't it? You're saying the property doesn't appraise, you're exercising your appraisal contingency, so you should be giving the seller your appraisal report. However, this contract makes it clear that that happens only upon the request of the seller. You see, some sellers don't want to see the appraisal report. I'm not going to get into the pros and cons of that position, but now this contract allows the seller to determine whether or not the seller will get that appraisal report. There's also another reminder in here of the no appraisal contingencies effect. And here is some new news that's not in the contract. We're talking about appraisals, and appraisals are done by appraisers. And in an earlier legal update from Broker Risk Management, we warned that there is evidence that some appraisers were actually making a determination about the fair market value of the property based upon the race or ethnicity of the owners of the property and or the people in the neighborhood. That issue came to the attention of the California legislature. Effective January 1st, 2022, it is now going to be illegal for appraisers to violate the fair housing laws. That just seems so obvious. It's amazing that we even have to have a law like that, but we do. It's a new law, goes into effect in January. However, there's a second part of that new law, which goes into effect on July 1st, 2022. A notice that's about 8 to 10 lines long, that's actually in the statutes, must now be included in all contracts after July 1, 2022, that makes it clear to buyers that not only can't appraisers be biased or influenced by fair housing classifications, but if the buyers don't like the appraisal report and think it is a violation of the fair housing laws, the new notice will give the buyers some contact information for reporting the appraisal. It's a very nasty notice. But what's really sad was that this notification requirement got passed after Carr had finalized the bulk of the contract. There's no room in the contract for this new notice. Carr is working on how to add it to their new contract. It will probably be done by an addendum, which is dangerous because the statute says the language has to be in all contracts after that date. But just be aware that there's going to be even more changes to the new RPA thanks to some actions by our California legislature. There's some quick contingency notes in paragraphs 8C and D. Paragraph 8C really should reference paragraph 12. We didn't quite make that change yet because that's what explains the full scope of the buyer's investigation contingency. And it also references all the documents that must be provided by the seller. We are off to paragraph 8E1, which deals with title. This contingency has three components. The first is that the buyer is to obtain a pre, which has to reveal the type of title policy that is going to be provided. The buyer then has to review the preliminary report, and the buyer needs to review any additional items or documents regarding status of title that's provided by the seller. Please make sure sellers understand that if they have any off-record agreements with neighbors regarding fence lines, easements, or access, that information must be provided to the buyer during their title investigation contingency. Page 6. And I have a question that's been asked of me several times. What happens if the title company issues a new preliminary report after the buyer has reviewed the original pre and has removed the title contingency? What happens? Well, it was a darn good question. And this new contract answers it with a hidden contingency. It's not really a contingency. It's just a new cancellation right. Because in paragraph 8E2, it now states buyer has a new cancellation right that lasts for 5 days after receipt of a revised preliminary report. However, the buyer can only cancel based upon that revised report if the revised report reveals material or substantial deviations from a previously provided pre. Now, this is Carr's first attempt to try and deal with this issue. I think it's a nice try. I'm concerned because there's no definition of what constitutes material or substantial deviations. If a buyer wants to know if their revised pre is materially or substantially different from the original, they should first check with the title officer. And if it truly is material or substantial, they should also check with their own qualified California real estate attorney, and then quickly determine whether or not they have the right to cancel for the 5-day period. There's no removal of this hidden cancellation right. It's strictly a 5-day period from receipt of a revised pre. That's all it is. Paragraph 8F deals with condos and cross-references all of the information that needs to be provided when there is a common interest development. And 8G has the leased and liened items. This is new. There is now 2 new separate cancellation rights for leased and liened items. Well, actually, only one is new. The other is the way it works now. The first one is that the buyer may cancel if the buyer is unable or unwilling to assume any lease or accept an existing lien. For example, a PACE lien or a leased solar system. That's a basis for the buyer to cancel. Well, let's say the buyer doesn't cancel. They want to proceed with the deal, but they refuse to sign the documents to enable them to assume the lease or accept the lien. Well, if the buyer refuses to do that, then the seller, after first delivering a notice to buyer to perform, telling the buyer that they have to sign the documents or cancel, then the seller will have the right to cancel at the end of those 2 days if the buyers don't sign the documentation. Previously, the seller had a separate cancellation right. Now it's a two-step process which requires a notice to buyer to perform. It's a little bit more cumbersome than it was before, but at least now both sides will know what is expected when it comes to dealing with the leased or liened items. One other thing that I do want to point out, buyers have the right to cancel simply because they don't want to assume the lease or maintenance agreement or the PACE lien. It's not just a question of do they qualify for it, but do they want it? Notice the words willingness to assume. That's part of the highlighted paragraph. This gives buyers a much broader cancellation right than many people have assumed in the past. Paragraphs 8H and 8I deal with the handling of contingencies and what can be done with them. This is essentially the same as it's always been. The only thing that is different is the highlighted language in yellow that deals with the review of reports for those items where the contingency time frame is set by a number or 5 days after receipt of those documents, whichever occurs later. If the buyer removes their contingency, the late delivery of that documentation does not create a new or revived cancellation right. So let's talk about how do you calculate 17 days or 5 days after receipt? How would you calculate that time frame? Well, here's a calendar. Let's assume that the contract was accepted on Tuesday, October 5th. That's day 0. You then count out 17 days. And 17 days from October 5th is October 22nd. That's the 17-day period, for example, for the buyer to review the HOA documents. But let's say the HOA documents were very late in coming in for whatever reason. Let's say the HOA documents aren't delivered to the buyer until Wednesday, October 20th. So which period of time is later, the 17 days or 5 days after receipt of the documents? Well, it's going to be the 5 days. So delivery of the documents, that becomes day 0. You then count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now the buyer has all day on the 25th to decide whether or not to remove their HOA review contingency. So keep in mind, this is how that calculation works. If the documents were delivered, for example, on the 13th, then the later of the 2 dates would be the 17th date, so then it would be the 22nd. It's really not tough, and it's really helpful if you remember to use the 0-day concept. Paragraph 9A has slightly been revised to expand the note that explains to buyers and sellers that stuff that gets included in the sale or excluded in the sale is not the stuff that's in the advertisements. It's not the stuff on the MLS. It's not even the stuff that's listed in the TDS. That stuff is not included or excluded unless specified in the chart in paragraph 3P. Fixtures, fittings, there's always transactional problems over this. And what the RPA committee has tried to do they've tried very hard to expand the definitions of the stuff that really is supposed to stay with the property unless otherwise agreed. For the last several years, the existing list of items that was supposed to stay with the property included the term window coverings. Many people didn't seem to understand what window coverings are. So now there's a parenthesis after that term, which says that it includes blinds, curtains, drapery, and even shutters. Anything which covers the window in whole or in part is a window covering that stays with the property. And when we left the committee, everyone seemed very satisfied that this was really all inclusive. But for those of you who are representing buyers, and those buyers want the drapery and the curtains, if the rods and the rings for the drapery and the curtains do not themselves cover the window, if they're up higher, then I strongly recommend that you add those items to the list in 3P, which is the personal property checklist. Because I can foresee some sellers saying, fine, you get the drapes and curtains, but I'm taking my decorative rod and rings. Warning, this was not dealt with here. Another issue that we handled with fixtures and fittings a few years back was light bulbs. I could not believe how many problems we had with sellers taking light bulbs. Well, now the term light bulbs includes the definition of smart bulbs. Why anyone would think a smart bulb is different, I don't know, but now they're clearly included. There's also a new broader definition of pool and spa equipment. The red warning note: sellers should carefully review this section prior to agreeing to a contract. And if they don't want to leave any or all of the items listed, then they need to specifically exclude it, either in the chart or in a counter offer. Paragraph 9B has more included items, such as security systems, home automation, and non-dedicated devices. This also specifies that leased and lien items are included, that the seller has to first notify the buyer of all of the information that's in the documentation relating to the leased or lien items, and then, of course, the cancellation rights will flow. Interestingly enough, we still have a problem with buyers thinking that when they get used stuff, that somehow sellers are warranting that the stuff is just fabulous. Please make sure that buyers do understand that as far as this contract is concerned, any of the personal property that is included in the sale is deemed to not have any value, and it is transferred without any seller warranty. There are 3 types of items that are excluded from the sale unless otherwise agreed. Obviously, the items identified in the chart in paragraph 3P2 are excluded. But in paragraph 9C, all audio video equipment is excluded. It's only included if the audio video equipment is itself attached to the property. That is, if it's directly built in over the fireplace, for example, then it's attached. But if the only way that the audio or video equipment is attached by use of a bracket, then that does not count as a fixture or fitting, and the seller is free to take it. Furniture that's secured to walls, that's they're secured solely for safety purposes, such as prevent falling and earthquakes, they're excluded. So the main category, though, for the excluded items is what's listed in 3P, and let sellers know that under the terms of this contract, if something gets removed and that creates a hole or other damage, the seller must repair the damage, but they don't have to paint it. The concept of the seller making it look like that item was never removed is gone. The seller just has to repair the hole, but they don't have to paint. The 7th page, we've got paragraph 10, which better explains all of the rules and regulations regarding all of the inspections and government requires, as well as home warranty issues. Please take a note, though, that if there are point of sale requirements, I know you don't have any where you are, but if there are financial consequences for failing to meet the installation requirements. They're now built into the contract. And paragraph 10C confirms that it's the buyer who chooses the home warranty plan. Paragraph 11A, statutory and supplemental disclosure forms. Oh my, there's so much here, but it's all stuff you pretty much already know, hopefully, because this paragraph reminds everyone that if the seller is required to fill out the TDS, then the seller has to also sign the first page, which is the natural hazards disclosure statement that is on top of the natural hazards packet. Under the contract, the seller is also required to fill out the SPQ if the seller has to fill out the TDS. And finally, if the seller has to fill out the TDS, then they have to fill out the fire hardening and defensible space advisory disclosure and addendum form, which we will talk about shortly. Not only are these forms required when the TDS is required, but if the seller is exempt and the seller doesn't have to fill out the TDS, then that one-page statement isn't required, even though the underlying report is. The SPQ is not required, and the fire hardening and defensible space advisory disclosure and addendum is not required. Instead, under the contract, the only thing that the seller fills out is the exempt seller disclosure. Paragraph 11A2 includes the definition, what constitutes a fully completed TDS. This is not something created by CAR. It's actually in the legislative rules that control the use of the transfer disclosure statement. A fully completed TDS consists of 3 components. The first, the seller must check a box in section 1. It's becoming clearer and clearer that it almost doesn't matter which box the seller checks. To have a fully completed TDS, the seller has to check one of those boxes. Even if the seller checks the box that says no substituted disclosures, the seller is still legally required to provide any and all reports that the seller has in their possession. The choice of box here does not control what documents the seller has to provide. Checking the box here merely indicates what of the documents the seller is supposed to provide the seller deems to be part of the TDS. This is a very dumb portion of this form. Several of us are trying to lobby to get it removed from the TDS. We'll see what happens. Section 2 is for the seller's information. Sellers have to fully complete it. They have to answer every question. They can't skip anything. If they answer yes to any of the questions, they have to add an explanation in the blank lines or in additional pages. Finally, if there is a listing agent, then the TDS is only completed when the seller's agent has done their disclosure. That does not mean just check the box and say, see attached added. To be fully completed, you have to actually attach the added that has been fully completed and signed. All of this must be in place to have a fully completed TDS. Now, simply because the definition of a fully completed TDS does not include the buyer's agent's added This contract makes it clear that the buyer's agent ad still is a required element for the buyer's agent. It just doesn't count as to when the buyer receives a fully completed TDS. The best time to do the buyer's avid is at the outset of the transaction, so the buyer has the buyer's agent's information as quickly as possible. Paragraph 11A3 now has a definition for what constitutes a fully completed SPQ and a fully completed exempt seller disclosure. It's exactly the same as a fully completed TDS, except that it doesn't mention section 1 or the agents section. It's just all the questions have to be answered and any yes responses have to be explained. Paragraph 11A4, new material facts. If there was anything added to the last version of the RPA, which has caused more turmoil than this paragraph, I don't know what it is. But I get calls on this paragraph literally every week. And every week I have to point out that someone has failed to read the entire paragraph. Because I got tired of that, I insisted, and you will now see that the only change to this paragraph is the fact that the last sentence is in bold print. That's a hint. When you see something in bold print in the contract, that means, hey, you really got to read this. So let's go through the new material facts provision. It starts off by saying, if the seller or the listing agent, that's the seller's agent, becomes aware of adverse conditions materially affecting the property or any inaccuracies in the seller's TDS, then the seller is to amend the TDS and give the buyer a new right to rescind or cancel. Well, that seems reasonable. The problem is that that doesn't happen very often. In fact, usually when there is a new material fact, it is something that the buyer discovered or that was included in a report that the buyer received. If that's how the information is discovered, then it isn't that the sellers become aware of it, it's that the buyer has become aware of it. Take a look at the yellow highlighted bold print language. Again, this has not changed from the existing contract, except it's in bolder print. If the buyer discovers information on their own, they went down, checked the county records and found that the septic system is only permitted for 2 bedrooms and there's 3 bedrooms. Oh, and nobody disclosed that. And the buyer demand that the seller amend the TDS. They can try, but the seller's not obligated to amend because it's the buyer who found it out. Let's say the seller says that everything was built with permits, but provides the buyers with a bunch of documents which show the stuff wasn't built with permits. Well, if the buyer receives that information in reports, then again, the buyer doesn't get to demand that the seller amend the TDS. The buyer's ability to amend the TDS is extremely limited. When can it happen? Well, let's say the seller remembers after the TDS has been delivered that they forgot to disclose that last year they had a flood in the garage. It's not in any of the reports. The seller now needs to disclose that information to the buyer, and the seller needs to amend the TDS as a result of this paragraph. So if the seller is required to amend the TDS under this paragraph, or because they talked to their attorney who said in that situation with the septic system, you really should have disclosed that and you now have potential liability, so you may want to voluntarily agree to amend the TDS, which, by the way, is a good thing when it happens. And sellers who refuse to amend the TDS, when buyers find out stuff, should be encouraged to talk to their own qualified California real estate attorney, because their attorney may encourage them to amend the TDS. So whether they're required to or they decide they should based upon legal advice, then to do that, you can use the CAR addendum form, and it's got a new note for the version that's coming out in December that says an amendment to the TDS may give the buyer a right to rescind. That's wishy-washy language, don't care for it, but at least it's in there. And that's how a seller would amend the TDS. The lead disclosure. This is a federal law requirement. It has not changed. However, this looks different because the form that is used, which is the lead-based paint and lead-based paint hazard disclosure acknowledgement and addendum form, has a new form reference. It's now the LPD, which stands for lead paint disclosure. It used to start with an F because it was a federal law, but nobody could find the form. So now it's referred to as the LPD. Big change. The 8th page. And here we are at the new law that went into effect this year, which has upset buyers, sellers, real estate agents, and attorneys up and down the state of California. This is one of those instances where the legislature was truly well-intentioned. They wanted to try and stop wildfires. Great. They wanted local jurisdictions to enforce defensible space laws. Great. But before they put any disclosure requirements on the backs of sellers, they should have checked to see how many local jurisdictions actually have those types of procedures in place. And of those that have them in place, how many have inspectors to actually certify whether or not there's been compliance. CAR investigated this issue and found out that only 5% of the state can actually provide the certification process at this point in time. Add to that problem, there's 2 different laws involved here, 2 different sets of legal requirements, and CAR decided to handle it all on one form. 2 laws. The first, fire hardening. The second, defensible space, combined on one form. I don't know that it would be much better if it was put on 2 different forms, but as it is now, it's a mess. So I will try to take you through it quickly. We start off with paragraphs 1 and 2, which are essentially advisories. Paragraph 2 looks like a disclosure, but it's really an advisory. Paragraph 1A explains the requirements for when a seller must make disclosures about fire hardening. Then it explains who has to comply with making the disclosures regarding defensible space. It has a nice paragraph about where to get information. So paragraph 1, clearly, totally an advisory. Paragraph 2, this is supposedly a disclosure, except that it's preset that the home is in a high or very high fire severity zone. Why is that preset like that? That's because this form is only needed if the property is actually in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. If it's not in that zone, the seller is not obligated to use it. If the seller is using it when they're not required to, then it's not truly a disclosure. Then it's at best an advisory, because the seller doesn't have to fill out the information in 3, and they don't really have to reach an agreement in section 4. This isn't well conceived, folks, but we're stuck with it. So let's talk for just 1 minute about who is really required to fill out this form. First, the seller has to be someone who has to fill out the TDS. I told you earlier, the seller's exempt from the TDS, they're exempt from doing this form. So first requirement, it has to be a seller who has to fill out the TDS. Second requirement, it has to be property that's in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. If either one of those is not true, you don't use the form. It's that simple. But with the fire hardening disclosure, that section only has to be filled in if, in addition to the first two requirements, the property was built before January 1, 2010. Why that date? Because at that point, the codes for new construction changed. That's how the law works. So please keep those rules in mind. The disclosure in Section 3 is only required if the seller fills out a TDS, the property's in a high or very high fire severity zone, and number 3, the property was built before January 1, 2010. Then we have Section 4. Section 4 is an addendum. It's an addendum because it deals with what the parties are supposed to do, depending upon whether or not there is a local ordinance in place. The preset or default choice is that there is no ordinance, and therefore the buyer has to obtain the documentation at some later point in time. Alternatively, the parties could agree that it'll be the seller's responsibility, but that means the seller is going to have to come back after close of escrow to do something. So choice B2 is illogical, and I don't recommend it. If there's no local ordinance, stick with the default choice in B1. If there is a local vegetation management or other defensible space ordinance in effect, then the parties have to reach an agreement as to who's going to be providing the documentation for the property to be in compliance. It can be either the buyer or the seller. It's negotiable. So keep in mind those different components. Whew. Paragraphs 11E and 11F are the cleanup paragraphs regarding the documents we've talked about so far. Paragraph E reminds everybody that you cannot waive the statutory disclosures in 11A, 1, 11B, 11C, and 11D, And of course, this sets up in F the time frame for the buyer to return the documentation to the seller. Paragraphs 11G, 1 and 2 relate to termination rights. The first paragraph makes it clear that the buyer has a 3-day right if personally delivered and a 5-day right if mailed or emailed to rescind or cancel the contract, which relates to the TDS, the NHDS single-page statement, the lead document, and the fire hardening and defensible space document. There is no 3 to 5 day right to rescind that flows from the exempt seller disclosure form. No notice to buyer to perform is needed. Once the statutory time period elapses, the buyer is deemed to approve the documents and nothing else is required except for the buyer to sign and return the documents. Paragraph 11G2 is brand new. It explains that if the buyer does not reach an agreement with the seller in paragraph 4 of the FHDS, the seller may cancel. Now, the reason it's structured this way is because the seller will be the person who will be filling out the FHDS form. And in all likelihood, most sellers are going to specify that whether there is or there isn't an ordinance in place, that it's going to be the buyer's responsibility. That's going to happen in the fourth section of that report, which is the addendum. If the buyer doesn't sign that form and agree to what the seller wants, then after issuing a notice to buyer to perform to sign that form, the buyer still refuses, then the seller may cancel. This gives the seller the power to control the contents of that document. Now we come to FERPA. I'm sure you all know that it stands for the Foreign Investment and Real Property Tax Act, but for many of us, the F stands for something else. There's a Jewish term called fakakta. Whenever I think about FERPTA, I think about fakakta. This is a bad law. This is an effort by the federal government to make buyers pay for sellers' property tax obligations, capital gains tax requirements with sellers who aren't part of the taxpayer system and who don't pay taxes. That law has not changed. Nothing about this law has changed. The only thing that has changed is that this purchase contract makes it clear that if the seller can't or won't provide the buyer with the FERPTA form, which includes their taxpayer ID number, that number has to be visible, it can't be blanked out. If they don't give the buyer that form, or they cannot get the qualified substitute from the title company, or the form that's provided does not have the magic words in it that the escrow officer has reviewed the seller's documentation and is swearing under penalty of perjury. If that magic language is not in there, then it's not a legally compliant QS. So if the seller doesn't provide the taxpayer ID number to the buyer, and the buyer can't get a QS that complies with federal law, then under this contract, the withholding will automatically take place. Listing agents, you need to sit your sellers down and explain the requirements of FERPTA. I would also encourage you to make sure that whatever title and escrow people you are using, that they are using proper QS forms. Because if they don't, and your seller can't or won't give their taxpayer number to the buyer, then that withholding is automatically going to take place. That is the import of this section. Paragraphs 11I and J are those statutory disclosures that you've seen for many years now. They're going to be joined soon by that new notice regarding appraisers. These two statutory notices reference websites. Under no circumstances should you be checking out those websites. If you go online and look up a property, then you're going to have to disclose all of the information that you reasonably would have learned by going onto that site. So stay off the site. The sites are there for buyers to check out. Sellers shouldn't look either. Paragraph 11K deals with condos and planned unit developments. It serves as a nice reminder that the seller has to disclose if the property is in one of those types of property arrangements, and it lists out the documents that the seller has to provide. The NHDS paragraph is a reminder that, those reports that go with the NHDS, they're required whether the seller has to do that NHDS statement or not. It also serves as a reminder that the seller is the person who, under this contract, has to provide the buyer with the earthquake guide and environmental hazards booklet. How many sellers do you think actually have those booklets available to give to buyers? Probably between 0 and none. So who needs to help the seller meet this contractual obligation? Aha, it's the seller's agent. Well, one way you can make sure that this is done is by using an NHDS provider who includes those pamphlets in the NHDS report. But some of the cheaper companies don't do that. So keep in mind when you're helping your seller choose the NHDS provider, make sure it's someone who actually has all of these booklets built into their report. If those booklets aren't there, then you need to get those booklets to your seller so the seller can meet their contractual obligations. How do you get those booklets? You go online. CAR has in its forms library a section called California ePubs. This is where you can get all of the required pamphlets. The law already tells sellers what we have been preaching to the real estate industry for years. All sellers of all types of properties, regardless of what forms they have to fill out, must disclose all known material facts. Anything which the seller knows which impacts the value or desirability of the property must be disclosed to the buyers. Okay, if that's the law, why is that in here? Well, because not everybody knows the law. So this paragraph has that reminder, but it also includes an obligation for the seller to disclose the last 5 years worth of known insurance claims. We used to be able to get this information with the NHDS reports. That's no longer feasible. So there's only two options. One is the seller gets that information from their own insurance broker, or the buyer can ask the seller to sign the ARC form, which is the authorization to receive and convey documents, and get the seller's authorization for the buyer to get that information directly from the seller's insurer or lender. The 9th page brings us to paragraph 12 and the buyer's investigation of property and matters affecting property. 12A explains the basic rights of buyers to conduct inspections, investigations, surveys, and studies. But precisely what it is that the buyer should be checking out is actually spelled out in 12B. The investigation right includes 3 important elements. The first is the inspections of the physical attributes of the property. It also lists the basic types of reports that buyers are encouraged to obtain. The second component is buyer investigation of insurance, which we've already talked about in connection with loans. And the buyer is to investigate everything that's in the buyer's inspection advisory. It's a 1-page document. I would encourage everyone to make sure that buyers sign that before they make a decision as to whether or not to waive or remove any inspection or investigation contingencies, because it has a laundry list of all the things buyers should be checking out, such as permits. So make sure that buyers understand that that's the second component. The third component of the investigation contingency is reviewing reports and the seller's and agent's disclosures and information. If you were to remove the entire investigation contingency, then the buyer would have no cancellation rights with respect to any of the matters described here. Don't remove those contingencies prematurely. And please use the right terminology. You need to know it's the investigation contingency when it comes to the contingency removal form. Recently, as this language is in the current contract as well, one buyer's agent informed the seller's agent that the offer was waiving the inspection contingency. The seller was elated. They got into contract. It was only then that they realized that the investigation contingency was still in effect. And oh my gosh, the buyer found things and they canceled. You need to understand the language that's in this contract. Do not get confused by what anybody else says. Sellers and their agents need to carefully review the CR form to figure out exactly what is being waived or removed. And buyer's agents need to carefully review that document, as well as the notice to buyer to perform, so that they know precisely what is in play and what is to be removed. There's a little note next to all buyer contingencies. If Randy would let me, I would bring out that ruler he is so afraid of, and I would hit everybody's hand when they check that box. But apparently I'm not really allowed to do that. So all I can tell you is please avoid using it. It's a bad box. Paragraph 12C and 12D, buyers still can conduct invasive testing. They still have to provide sellers with all reports. But this section now answers a question of, does an appraisal report constitute a report that the buyer has to give the seller? There's no law in this. There's no statute. Nothing in the world of law has changed. The only thing that's changed is the CAR has decided to take a position on this issue. And CAR's position is that an appraisal report is not really a report. And therefore, buyers don't have to give it. In fact, they shouldn't give it. The only exceptions are that if it's an appraisal done in connection with an FHA or VA loan, CAR believes it should be given to the seller no matter what. And again, if the buyer is exercising their appraisal contingency because of the contents of the opinion of value, that the property is not worth the agreed upon value, then the seller is to receive the report if the seller requests it. Some people don't like this definition. It doesn't matter. This is what the contract now provides. The buyer indemnification provision has not changed. It's the same as it is now. Buyers are responsible for anything that happens as a result of their inspections or the repairs that they carry out. I do recommend that if there are going to be buyer inspections or repairs, that sellers be encouraged to file the notice of non-responsibility form. This will help protect your sellers, and it's a good thing to do. Paragraphs 13A through 13G deal with title and vesting. We start off with A and the concept of whoever is paying for title provides the pre. B makes it clear title is taken in its present condition. C sets the time frame for the seller to provide all necessary information to the escrow officer to help clear title. D, seller to disclose to buyer matters affecting title. Paragraph E deals with if a buyer is a legal entity, they must cooperate with the geographical targeting order, which does not apply to any of the North Bay counties, so you don't have to worry about that. Paragraph F specifies that a grant deed will be recorded. And that language was changed yesterday because if it's a stock cooperative, then it's not going to be by grant deed, it's going to be by a stock certificate. And then finally, in paragraph G, as long as it's available for the property, the buyer is to receive an ALTA, CLTA policy. If it's not available, then the CLTA standard policy is to be obtained. If you or your clients do not know or understand the differences between these types of policies, you can get information from most title companies, or you can go online to the CAR site and you can get an excellent chart that CAR has created to compare the different types of title policies. 10th page, paragraph 14 is still paragraph 14. Yay! Literally, one of the stated goals of the Forms Committee was to make sure that no matter what we did with any other paragraphs, that paragraph 14 would still be paragraph 14. So it is. Paragraph 14A lists all of the documents sellers must deliver to either the buyer or the escrow, but they're listed out by paragraph references, and that's not really very user-friendly. So I decided to list them all out, and one of the slides that you will be receiving lists out all of the paragraphs and the documentation that the seller has to provide to comply with paragraph 14A. Paragraph 14B lays out the procedures for how buyers are to make repair requests and how and when you remove contingencies. First off, the buyer has the specified amount of time in paragraph B to review and sign all of the documents. Before, I can't say this enough, before the buyer decides to remove or waive contingencies, especially those that relate to anything which needs to be repaired, the buyer can make a request for repairs or credits using the RR form. Paragraph B2 is one that I don't think a lot of people really read, because I get lots of complaints about what to do with sellers who refuse to respond to the RR. Well, this language hasn't changed, and it says seller has no obligation to agree to or respond to buyer's request for repairs or credits. What does it mean if the seller doesn't respond? It probably means they're not going to go along with it. So the buyer is going to have to decide, do I go ahead and remove my contingencies knowing that the seller isn't going to do this? Or should I cancel? Explain that to your buyers. Do not have them sitting around interminably waiting. Because if the seller issues a notice to buyer to perform, the buyer is going to have to make that decision. So make sure buyers understand the interrelationship of request for repairs, credits, and contingency removal. Paragraph B3 explains the removal or cancellation process. And this paragraph again reminds everybody about the timing issue, that for contingencies for the review of documents, if it says blank number of days or 5 days after receipt of the document, whichever is later, that if the contingency is removed, the late delivery of documents does not revive the contingency. It doesn't create a new contingency. It does nothing. The contingency is gone. Could the buyer have a right to terminate for some other basis? Yes, but the only one who's going to be able to determine that is the buyer's qualified California real estate attorney. Finally, paragraph 14B4 is the explanation of active contingency removal methodology. There is no passive contingency removal methodology. The only passive time periods relate to the statutory timeframes for the right to rescind and the 5 days after receipt of the revised decree. Paragraph 14C explains that sellers have 3 different rights to cancel. The first is for the buyer's failure or unwillingness to remove contingencies. The second is for the buyer's failure to perform contractual obligations. And then finally, the seller's right to exercise their own contingencies. The first 2 necessitate the issuance of a notice to buyer to perform before the seller can cancel, and the revised language explains how the expenses are deducted. Those same 3 rights exist for buyers, except in reverse, and the first 2 necessitate the buyer issuing a 2-day notice to perform. So let's talk about a true enhancement to the new contract. It's what has been taken out. The 2-day notice to perform is now 2 days. It's not 2 or blank days. There's no confusion as to how many days that notice to perform is to be. It's 2 days, period. It's counted in days, not hours. It cannot be given any earlier than 2 days prior to the expiration of the applicable time frame. And if the thing is delivered at the wrong time, i.e., it's delivered too early, it's deemed invalid, and a new notice to perform must be delivered. The notice to perform to seller and to buyer have both been expanded. They include many provisions, including those from the COP, as well as the CAR's SPRP, which is seller to provide replacement property. Paragraph 14F is a provision I would encourage you to review with buyers before they remove contingencies. This paragraph explains what it means to remove the contingency. It's not just a procedural act. The buyers are assuming all liability and responsibility and expense for the non-delivery of any reports, disclosures, or information outside of seller's control, and any repairs or corrections pertaining to that contingency or inability to pay financing unless otherwise agreed that the seller is responsible. It has serious consequences. So make sure you review that with your buyers. The 11th page, now we get into, oh my goodness, the seller's effect of removing their contingencies. Same concept. If the seller has a contingency, for example, to find replacement property, make sure the seller understands this paragraph. The demand to close escrow paragraph was modified and then modified again yesterday. It's now 3 days. It's not 3 or blank days. It's just 3 days. There cannot be a shorter time frame for the demand to close escrow. It can be given as early as 3 days prior to the scheduled close of escrow. And if it's sent out too early, it's deemed invalid and the party needs to issue a new DCE. Paragraph 14H, the effect of cancellation on deposits. Most of this is really the same as it's always been. What's important here is the new note. And the new note may sound like a lawyer wrote it, and that's because I did. And it's in here because I truly believe that the buyer and seller have to understand that it is not the responsibility of agents or even the escrow officers to determine who is entitled to the money or whether or not the parties are acting in good faith, which would determine whether or not someone has breached the contract. Since this note is in here, this is also a reminder to you not to give any opinions on that. Who should buyers and sellers go to for that opinion? Read the paragraph. It's a qualified California real estate attorney. I also encourage people to read paragraph 15, which has not changed. Sellers agreed to make repairs, are obligated to provide specific documentation to buyers before the buyer's final verification. The final verification is like it always is. It's a walkthrough. It's supposed to take place a certain number of days before close of escrow. It's not a contingency. It doesn't create any cancellation rights. The buyer actually can waive their right to do the final verification by filling out the bottom of the VP form. But that brings me to an interesting concept. Is the buyer obligated to use the VP form if they conduct the verification of property inspection? And the answer is no. It's just recommended that they do. So there is no obligation for this buyer's agent to deliver this form to the seller. They only have to deliver it if the buyer actually uses it. Prorations, compensation to brokers, scope of duty, escrow instructions, none of this has changed. I've only highlighted the scope of duty because if a buyer or seller asks you to do something which you normally don't do, check this paragraph. If it's listed in this paragraph as something you don't do, show it to your client and explain it's outside the scope and course and scope of your duties. Well, we're moving right along. And what has happened to this? This is an interesting thing. The additional escrow instructions have all been changed. There have been a few little exceptions, and most of it isn't of any real significance. The only thing that's truly important for you to know about these sections is that the copy of all of the contract documents need to go to escrow within 3 days after acceptance. If the contract is changed by an addendum or amendment, that documentation has to be given to the escrow holder within 3 days of it being fully signed. This also includes yet another reminder that if the qualified substitute does not comply with federal law requirements, the parties instruct escrow to withhold the required amount. There's also a nice new note that the compensation instructions cannot be amended or revoked without the agreement of the brokers. That was already legally true. It's just been added in there to let everybody know that it's true. 20 says the selection of service providers, it's up to the clients. And if they use somebody you recommend, you're not guaranteeing the service. The MLS paragraph discusses the fact that the pictures cannot be removed once they're out in the internet world. 22 has the prevailing party attorney's fees as between the parties, not the agents. And of course, equal opportunity is there. You can't discriminate. You're probably thinking I skipped 23, and I did for a reason. It's the new a new assignment provision, and it's got a lot of new bells and whistles. You're going to probably like this for the most part, but it's only going to work with the new contract. It does not work with the current contract. First off, new concept. Yes, the buyer has the right to assign, but if they're assigning it to the buyer's own trust or to any wholly owned entity owned by the buyer, then the buyer not only has the right to assign it, but the buyer doesn't have to get the seller's permission and doesn't have to re-sign any of the documents. But that's only if the trust or the entity exists at the time of the assignment. Next, although the buyer can assign all or any part of buyer's interest, they can only do so to any third party with the seller's prior written consent. To get the seller's prior written consent, the buyer has to reveal who is the assignee. The name of the assignee has to be delivered to the seller, and the buyer also has to provide additional information to get the seller's approval, including whether or not the buyer has received any compensation to do the assignment. If the assignee has to get a loan, then to get the seller's approval, the assignee has to show that they've been pre-approved for the loan. And then finally, if the buyer fails to do the request for assignment within the agreed upon timeframe in the grid, then the seller has the right to automatically refuse to allow the assignment. This lays out answers to virtually all of the questions that have been raised in connection with assignments. I urge you to read this carefully if there's going to be an assignment. So whether you're representing the seller or the buyer, you know all of the required steps. Paragraph 25 takes us to definitions. If there's a word in the middle of a sentence in the contract that starts with a capital letter, it means it's a defined term. And many of these terms have not changed. CAR form still means you're supposed to use the CAR form that's designated, but if the parties both agree and sign some other form, then that form is okay. Day still means calendar days, except delivery of deposit to escrow is based on business days. None of this has changed. Here's the big change. There is now a definition for counting days. The concept of 0 day is now in this contract. And all of this language has been designed to eliminate the questions of how many days are involved after the delivery of a document or prior to an event. So how do you count days after an event? Let's say it's the notice to buyer to perform. Let's say the contingency was up on Monday. The seller is mad, instructs the listing agent to issue a notice to buyer to perform. That's done on Tuesday. That's day 0. Day 1 is Wednesday, day 2 is Thursday. That's the last day for the buyer to decide what to do about their contingency. If they take no action, then the seller has the ability to try to cancel on Friday. Let's say the contingency was up on a Thursday, and the next day the seller wanted the notice to buyer to perform. The date that the notice to perform is issued is day 0. Day 1 can be any day of the week. Day 1 is then for Saturday. But day 2 cannot be a weekend or holiday. And assuming that Monday is not a holiday, then day 2 would be that next Monday. the seller wouldn't be able to cancel until that Tuesday. Let's count days before an event. Let's say the contingency is due to be up on Thursday. How early can the notice to buyer to be formed be issued? Well, the contingency time up, that's 0 day. And then you count backwards, 2 days. That's how easy it is. When do you issue the demand to close escrow? It has to be no earlier than 3 days before the scheduled close of escrow. The scheduled close of escrow is day 0. 3 days before is a Sunday. Remember, it's only the last date of performance that cannot be a weekend or holiday. And here it works to issue it on Sunday. My only proviso with issuing a demand to close escrow: don't have your client issue a demand to close escrow unless you make sure that your client is also fully able to perform. Paragraph 25K defines delivered, delivered, or delivery. There's new language in here allowing for the use of links. Now, what's important here is that delivery can be made to the party or their authorized agent. Their authorized agent is you. If you put your name and your contact information in on the last page, that you are the authorized agent. If the buyer, for example, receives a document electronically, that's delivery. That's kosher under this contract. But now also, if they get a link to access documents, that is also authorized. But many of us were worried that buyers might not like the link, may not be able to use it. So what has been added into this section is a new requirement that if the recipient of a link is unable or unwilling to open it, then the recipient must notify the sender in writing within 3 days using the RFR form, that's the receipt for reports form, which has been revised. If no timely notification is given, that 3-day comes and goes, then the party receiving the link is deemed to have consented to the use of links. So if you have a client who rejects documents sent via links, you use the RFR form and you fill in this final section, paragraph 6. If that's filled in, then actual documents have to be delivered, not links. There's more definitions in 25L through 25Q. Most of these have not changed. What's new is there's a definition for what constitutes unless otherwise agreed. That language appears in the current contract and it's not defined. It's used 25 times in the 16 pages in the new contract. And what it means is an agreement in writing signed by both parties and delivered to each. This was added because unless otherwise agreed does not mean an email from an agent or a unilateral statement by one side. Unless otherwise agreed means there has to be a written change signed and delivered by the parties. Paragraphs 26 through 28 answer 3 important questions. First, what happens if there is an inconsistency in the initials to liquidated damages or arbitration? The answer is you need to do a counteroffer. Who makes changes to the terms of the agreement and how is that done? The answer is it can only be done in writing, signed and delivered by buyer and seller. What does it mean when someone is signing in a representative capacity? It means that they're not the actual party, they're signing on behalf of someone or something. It's all here. All of this is explained. The 14th page, oh my gosh, it has more boxes. Yes, because you have the only 2 other provisions which have to be agreed upon. The first is liquidated damages. There's been no change to the law. But when you get this slide, I encourage you to read the relevant code sections. It doesn't necessarily mean what you think it means. But it does also have the magic language that for the increased deposit to be included in liquidated damages, you have to use the DID form. Mediation is not optional. It's automatic, but it's only automatic as to buyer and seller. Agents don't have to participate and should not participate. You should not go to a mediation or any other hearing without first securing your broker's approval, and your broker is going to first consult with legal counsel. This paragraph was modified yesterday to make it clear that the exclusions from arbitration that are in paragraph 31 apply to mediation, even if the parties don't agree to arbitration. Arbitration, it hasn't changed either, except for one important issue. The parties, but not the agents, can now decide in advance who's going to be the arbitrator. This will seldom be used, but it's strictly something that the clients may want to do. This includes the exclusion provision, and again, realtors are not obligated to participate and shouldn't do so. The 15th page, we finally come to signatures. Expiration, well, we now have that up in the front of the offer. If there is an entity buyer, no RCSD is needed because it's built in. And yet another reminder that the RPA is 16 pages. The representative capacity signature disclosure is still going to be around. It's not going to be needed at the time of entering a contract because it's built in. It's also going to be built into the listing agreement. It's only going to be needed if there's a buyer representation agreement or if someone who is an assignee is an entity or is acting on behalf of someone else. So we've limited the use of that form. The buyer signature, same as always, whether they're signing in pen or electronically, they do it here. What's important to note, there's plenty of room. And if the buyer is an entity, you check a box. And if there's more than two buyers, you check a box. If there's more than two signers, then you use the CAR form ASA. That's when you use that form. It cannot be used to add new buyers once an agreement has been accepted. It merely adds signature lines. Paragraph 33, the seller can accept. They can counter with either a counteroffer or a backup addenda, or rather than being nasty and saying the seller rejects, it now says the seller has not accepted the offer. So keep that new language in mind. The 16 pages is really the contract. It's all the information about the real estate brokers with your license number, the escrow holder information, and to meet the listing agent's ethical obligations, the presentation of offer box. Initials are required on all 16 pages. Make sure you don't send the form to anyone unless you check to make sure that everything's been initialed. CAR has revised or created 63 forms that are referenced in the RPA. This is a chart of those forms. The final page shows the purchase agreement forms that are being conformed to work the same way as the RPA. And the last two are the discontinued purchase agreement forms. We did it. It takes 3 hours of concentrated work to get through this document. And I want to thank you all for hanging in there with me. Randy, I'm sending it back to you and Gary.
Vicki, thank you. That is so informative. Of course, we're going to all have more and more questions in regards to it. It's interesting on part of the presentation today, how much just yesterday actually would have been beneficial in this new contract in regards to disclosures and the appropriate way to handle that as far as additional disclosures or change documents.
Yeah, it's you know, a lot of people were thinking, well, why is it so much longer? Well, it is 5 pages longer. But if you consider the fact that a good two pages are really because of representative capacity signature disclosure issues. You're eliminating the use of that separate form. It's built in. So that's part of it. The other three additional pages are, there's not much that's completely new aside from the assignment provision, which is totally new. But the rest of those additional 3 pages is to explain how things work and answer the questions that weren't really fleshed out in the current contract. So from my perspective, those additional 5 pages are a godsend because it should make it easier to make sure you have the right people signing in the right capacity. It should also make sure that everybody is literally on the same page when it comes to what do terms mean and how does the contract work. That's why it's as long as it is. I think it's beneficial and hopefully everybody will enjoy it once they get used to using it.
Yeah, it does. It definitely handles some things that we've had issues with. And we want to say that, you know, some of the agents say that this was better than Gov Hutchins, but then again, I would have agreed to that before it even started. So thank you, Vicki. Gary, you got something to add here?
No, that's quite a marathon, Vicki. Again, congratulations for pulling it together, and we appreciate it to our group.
Thank you, Vicki.
We appreciate you, Vicki. Thank you very much. I hope everybody got some value out of it today. And have a great weekend.
Bye, everybody. Thanks, Vicki.
That's all from the Gary and Randy show today. And again, thank you, Vicki.